Hi, thanks for watching. My name's Katie. Katie Crafty Mom is my channel, and I'm going to show you today how to make a foundation paper pieced flying geese pattern. We're going to turn it into a coaster. And I have a printout on my blog, which I'll have the link below. Some of the supplies I like to use is a rotary cutter and a rotary cutting ruler that will show at least a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you don't have those, you can use a regular ruler and a pair of scissors. That's fine. I like using a hot iron. Of course, if you don't want to have a hot iron right next to your work surface, you can always use a quilter's seam roller or finger press your seams. I'm using a paper that's specifically made for foundation paper piecing. You put it in your printer just like you would regular typing paper. The purpose of this paper is just to make it tear easily. It has a newspaper texture to it. You can use regular typing paper. You don't have to buy a special paper just for this project. I've used typing paper for years on small projects like this, but if you do want that, it is available. So right now I'm going to show you my light. It's actually a light from IKEA that I had purchased for our living room, and I just couldn't find the right place to put it. And then it ended up in my craft room, and then I was sewing, and then I started paper piecing and was like, hey, I can use that as my light box. So now it is my light box. So you can see, I can see through the paper and I can see the pattern. Make sure that the first piece that you do on your paper piecing, you face it out. So actually you're going to be making it backwards, if that makes any sense. It really won't matter for this pattern because it's symmetrical, but just keep in mind when you are paper piecing that the pattern that you see on the top of the print is going to be the opposite of that when you actually sew it. So I'm showing you here that I used the light box to line up my fabric along that seam line. And then I went ahead and I pinned it along the seam line and flipped it to test it out to make sure that it fit within those boundaries. And then I just went ahead and sewed right on top of that line, the sewing line. And now I'm going to press my seam open so I can see what it looks like. And then I'm going to fold it back and fold the paper back and trim a 1/4 inch off of that seam. And that'll just get that excess fabric out of my way. Make sure you do fold the pattern so that you don't trim off the pattern. And then what you're going to see me doing is I'm going to fold the pattern forward on the next seam line so that I can trim some more of that excess fabric off. I'm going to give it a little more than a 1/4 inch just to make sure I don't accidentally cut too much, just like that. And now I'm going to use my extra piece on the other side. When paper piecing, you're usually doing weird angles, so you might, when you're first starting out, stick with prints that aren't directional. So you'll see that when I'm sewing, I like to use a leader. So it's basically like a little scrap of fabric. I'm trimming it off right there. And I'm going to loosen my thread and then put it back in my sewing machine. And that just keeps my thread from constantly having to pull my thread out, so I'm wasting thread, or a lot of times I will have to rethread it because I won't make my thread long enough. So we're just going to continue the process. I'm going to make sure my pieces are right sides together before I trim, because I don't want to trim off the piece I just sewed on there, and fold the pattern back down. And there we have the first flying geese pattern. And now you just decide if you want to do each triangle a different fabric, or if you want to do each one the same. I ended up doing each triangle the same and each side the same. But it could be fun to do a fussy cut on the triangles, so because they're easier to line up and see what direction it is. Just know that like put it upside down because it's going to flip up, or if you want your triangles to go the other direction. Now I'm just going to speed up my video because we're doing the same thing. We're just repeating it a couple more times until we get our project finished. So we're adding a piece, looking at it to make sure it's lined up, pinning it on the line, flipping it over to make sure it fits within the square. You want to make sure those side pieces are long enough that they hang over the edge of the outside square. That inside square is going to be where your seam goes. So you want to make sure your fabric on the sides is long enough that it will fit inside that outer square. As we continue, we're almost finished with all the piecing. I'm adding one more of the triangles on top, and then that will complete our 3 flying geese. The reason why I love doing flying geese with a paper piecing pattern is it just makes it so easy to get perfect. I am not a super perfectionist when it comes to quilting, so this is a way that I can feel like a perfectionist without really having to be one. So now we're just going to make sure that we will trim off all the edges now that we're completed. Trim that outside line. Make sure you don't trim on the inside line. And then you can tear off all the paper once you're all completed. We've got to tear off the paper before we do the quilting, because otherwise that paper will get trapped inside your project. And you don't want to do that because it's not water soluble. This is where the foundation paper piecing comes in handy because it rips so easily. And making sure your stitch length is at a 1.7, so it's a shorter stitch length. It perforates the paper so that it just falls apart really easily. Now I just am lining up my pattern on top of a piece of batting that I had left over from another quilt project. And I'm just laying up both of my pieces right next to each other, and I'm just going to pin them on there so that they don't move when I'm sewing them. I'm going to put pins inside each one of the triangles. I just don't want them to wiggle around, and I'm going to do a top stitch right across the bottom of the triangles. So it really isn't a lot of quilting. It's just enough to hold that batting in place. At this point, I am not putting any fabric behind the batting, so we just have the layer of batting and the pattern piece that you did on top of it, and I'm going to just stitch right on top of it. My sewing machine didn't have any trouble, but I had a thin batting that was, maybe if you're using, that's more like a fabric. So if you have trouble with this on your sewing machine, maybe use something like a piece of felt. You can buy little felt squares from a local craft store for pretty cheap, and I think those would be just as effective as using a scrap piece of batting. So if you don't have batting that looks like this, that's really solid and held together more like a fabric, as you know, some batting can be really fluffy and light and hard to sew through unless you have a quilt sandwich, then just use a piece of felt. Simple fix. And if you have an old towel laying around that you just want to use and you don't want to go buy something, do that. Use what you have. That's what I'm all about. All right, let's go to the next step. I'm stitching around each one just to kind of hold the edges in place, because I'm going to sandwich these together with a backing piece of fabric. And I just want to make sure that my square stays nice and square and my batting stays nice and square. So I've got it all top stitched, but I top stitched really close to the edge because I didn't want that seam to show once I add the backing piece onto my coaster. So I'm just trimming around the edge of my quilt piece that we made. And I've got a piece that I cut out that's just a little bit larger than our piece that I made, and we're just going to sandwich that together. I'm just going to use the quilted backing as my guide, and then you can always go back and trim it after you sew or before you sew, so that you don't have too much fabric inside that seam. Now that you have them both pinned, you can go ahead and do a 1/4 inch seam all the way around. Do make sure that you leave a small opening in the middle of one. I ended up leaving the opening on the side just so it wouldn't be on the top or the bottom. I thought it might be less noticeable. So you leave that small opening in the middle so you can turn it. So once you get all the 1/4 inch seams sewn, then we'll trim the corners, and that helps with the bulk of the extra fabric in your seam. And I'm trimming down my seams, and then you'll see me turning it right side out. And I'm using a pencil to poke out the corners. Once you get it all turned right side out, you might want to give it a press and then go ahead and top stitch all the way around. This will close up the opening that we left open for turning. Don't forget to check out my blog for the free pattern. And also, I'd love for you to share it with me on Instagram. I'm Katie Crafty Mom, no spaces. That's where you can find me. And if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I've got lots more videos planned coming up in the future. So I'll see you then.